Recording is in progress, and I have one thing to say at the beginning of this episode. Ra-da-da-da-da-da-da, ra-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm sorry, I've been thinking about that ever since we chose this episode.
Hmm.
So I am John McDonald. I am an American playwright in the Pacific Northwest. And joining me again is my lovely cohort in crime, Magnus. Hello, Magnus.
Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Yes, hello. Today we are doing depending upon how you decide to say it, we're either doing X-Men 92, X-Men Blue if you're a comics fan, or X-Men the animated series if you're a Fox kid like me. And there's a lot of history wrapped into this animated series, which is why my background for anyone watching this on YouTube much later is the crow's nest in the danger room, and this is the only time there's ever a crow's nest in the danger room, where Professor X and Cyclops are safely watching their teammates getting their booties handed to them.
Ah, it brings back so many memories. I was going to say, for people of discerning taste, you could almost call this the best X-Men, if you want to go with how people know things. But I know that's a matter of taste.
Well, it's not just it's. I did some research for this last night actually because I have a lot of interesting factoids like I did for the Golden Girls because when I come across pop culture, I come at it at what time and place is it in and what does it influence. And so I kind of realized last night, and I knew this originally, is that the reason Kitty Pryde as Shadowcat is not in the show is because she was part of the failed pilot that didn't get greenlit. Because originally, before this X-Men, there was supposed to be a Shadowcat show, which is the
Yes.
reason she is not in this. But her lack of
Oh,
being in this means they have to switch some things around that she was part of in the comics, but to keep the storylines. So Jubilee just doesn't take over Shadowcat, and then later, when you get the Bryan Singer X-Men movie, the Rogue character, the kind of intro into the world. But it changes some things slightly about events in the show that are being transponsored from the comics. It's really interesting to look at from adaptation, but also for people that are fans of the 80s X-Men, because almost all the plot lines in the show were 80s X-Men plot lines, like specific to the 80s.
So in today's episode, we'll be discussing the 90s, the 90s anime, you could almost say, because there was certainly a lot of anime influences within this X-Men cartoon. But we'll be discussing the cartoon and exactly why we felt it made such a great impact and our personal favorite elements, shall we say, from it.
And this is the X-Men cartoon from 92 to 95. So this is not going to include X-Men Evolution. I don't think this is going to include like side Marvel projects like X-Men versus or Hulk versus Wolverine or any of the straight to DVD movies.
No.
We may talk a little bit about Spider-Man because there is a like 2-episode crossover where Spider-Man comes in, but there's a lot to that history of the history that I know as well. So yeah, there's a lot going on here.
Just for time's sake, and also dare I say for sanity's sake, it's probably best just to focus on this cartoon, because otherwise one could quickly run off in all sorts of directions discussing the X-Men.
And what's interesting is that this cartoon is both really groundbreaking, but it's also a product of its time in a lot of ways. A lot of us 90 kids that watched cartoons in America have different memories of it because different stations were airing things at different times. But one unifying memory is that, except for really kind of weird and offbeat cartoons that were coming out at the time, like Duckman and The Critic and everything Nicktoons was doing, almost all the properties on Fox and Disney at the time were kind of adaptations or reboots of something. So X-Men here is kind of coming around at the same time as Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, the TV series, Hook, which was Peter Pan and the Pirates, the cartoon, Batman, the animated series, which had a life with X-Men and then went off by itself, and all the stuff happening on Disney Afternoon with like Tailspin and Chip and Dale. So it's just a really interesting thing where we were basically taught that things could be adapted with no problem, which is, I think, why sometimes people of my generation have issues with when adaptations go awry, because we know adaptations can work because the X-Men and Batman did it, and they're arguably quote unquote definitive adaptations of things.
It almost makes you wonder, and I'm just have this little tangent thought before I touch upon my first main point for the X-Men. I almost wonder whether the success of those iconic cartoons, so we're talking about X-Men, you've mentioned Batman, to a lesser extent, there was the Superman series that came out around the same time, the Spider-Man series from a Marvel standpoint. I wonder whether, because they did so well, they cemented people's, like a new generation's love for these characters and helped carry them along. And that then had impact on what movies came out, say, a decade or so later. Because if you think about it, the first round of X-Men movies, the live action ones, came out about, let's have a think. It was about 20 odd years ago. So if you think about it, it was only a few years after the end of this X-Men cartoon that we had Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, Halle Berry as Storm, that new inclusion. It's really shocking, actually, to think how closely the one ending and the other one beginning is. And I'm fairly certain the first X-Men movie was about 20 years ago or so.
You would actually be off by 2 years. It was released worldwide on July 14th, 2000. I had to Wikipedia that to see what year that actually was, because I was like, it's been a while, but I don't know how long it's been.
I knew it was a few years gap. I wasn't thinking they were released the same year, but that's what I mean. If you think about it, it was really close together.
Yeah. Well,
so
it's interesting. It's interesting too when you bring up Superman. We can talk about this if we do like a Superman TV versus Superman film episode. But the only Superman, because I know there was like a reboot of the Justice League that was animated, but in America, the really big Superman thing in the 90s was the Terry Hatcher, Dean Cain romantic dramedy, New Adventures of Superman and Lois, of Clark, or Superman and Lois, yeah. So like the Superman cartoon didn't reach the level. I can picture it too, but for the life of me, like when I think of Superman in the 90s in America, I think of Terry Hatcher and Dean Cain before he went all fundy weird. So
yes, that's itself almost worthy of a podcast episode in itself.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about it when we talk about Melissa Joan Hart. So never fear, I have plenty of opinions.
No, but I know what you're meaning. In that case, the live action did far better than the animated product. But I think it all still ties in together. And certainly, it in a way kept these characters alive within the public consciousness beyond the realm of the comic books, because comic books have their own fan base. And I know there's a lot of people that will casually read comic books as well. But if you think of, I'm trying be very careful not to go off too much on a tangent here. But if you think about now the MCU, that has done far more to popularize Iron Man, Captain America, and everything else related to the Avengers than anything else that's come before it. And you're going to have a whole generation that will have them as their heroes.
Well, for the X-Men, especially this X-Men, I don't think that's off topic at all. I think if we were talking about Fantastic Four, I would have a completely different story to tell you. But I think it's important to realize that in X-Men canon, pretty much across the board, after this series ends in about 95, 96, depending upon who you ask, X-Men in the comics kind of went through a pretty long slump. Like reportedly, this is the time when people really kind of fell out of love with the X-Men before I think it was Chris Claremont came back. This is where we have all the sideways through time without any reason kind of thing. This is the meandering plot lines. I think this is even before House of M. So in a way, this animated series specifically telling all those big 80s stories and this adaptation specifically, for me, from what I remember, kind of saves the X-Men from its own cancellation for several reasons, one of which is something that I'm going to talk about when we get to actually two of the reasons I have. And I think one of them coincides with one of yours. So kind of what's that first thing that you want to talk about?
Well, we've already touched upon it. So one of the main points that I love this version of the X-Men for is both the iconic characters it creates. When you think of the X-Men, your mind will automatically go to Storm, Wolverine, Professor X, all of them. And we had the characters beforehand and such, but this cartoon did so well in establishing this version of the characters as so immediately recognizable that they became very iconic to a lot of people. Storm's Shakespearean speeches, for God's sakes,
this is also the comic where they really amped up her one fear that she has. Do you remember what her one fear is? Because they really amp it up. They make it's like a minor plot point, and I think it's the opener of season 2 in Genosha, if I remember correctly. Like she has like her one fear gets like a half an episode.
Isn't it tiny spaces?
Yeah, she has the same fear they gave Wonder Woman in the Super Friends hour. That Hanna-Barbera did. They gave her kind of that claustrophobia thing. Yeah, and I think this is the only time where you see Storm actually afraid of anything. When I think of her in the comics, I think of her either in the X-Men kind of being second in command in like an Uhura capacity almost, or being in Wakanda and being married to Black Panther and then not being married to Black Panther for some reason.
That's a whole other kettle of fish.
Yes.
No, you're right. Storm has always been very controlled, very calm, and has a clear authority to her figure. I think that's one of her traits that she's had to learn, because I think she's well aware if she lost control of her power, things would go rapidly down the shitter.
She could literally rip the planet apart, which is why she's one of the most powerful mutants in the universe. Her, Magneto, and Iceman, I think, all have the ability to actually rip the planet apart if they were so inclined.
I mean, that's why that evil spirit in Africa, during the episode that she goes back to her home country to see her adopted son, that's why it's so eager to get control of her, because it recognizes that she could be such a force of sheer destruction.
I would like to talk about the Shadow King. I would like to save the Shadow King actually for our Legion episode when I talk about Dan Stevens. So I would like to save Shadow King for a future episode, actually, unless you have something really provocative to say, because I love provocative things. So.
Unfortunately, there's no provocative things about the Shadow King up my sleeve today. But I'm sure with a little time and effort, I could come up with something that will make your eyes pop out of their skull. But
I live in America, baby. Nothing's going to make my eyes pop out of my skull. I've seen some things.
Oh dear. But yes, when I think of the X-Men, it's just the iconic characters spring to mind. And another thing that I really loved about it is the diversity. I struggle to think of another show from around that time that had a team that was composed equally of men and women, and they had diversity in their backgrounds as well. Some came from well-to-do families, others came from poorer backgrounds and such. And they did try to diversify with ethnicity as well. It didn't always work, but they did try to do that. And that is a point that I really enjoyed about this version of the X-Men.
Now, of course, the downside of that, I mean, obviously not for me. I actually also really enjoyed that. But when I think of that diversity, I also think of the hate mail that the writers received for putting Jubilee kind of as the window into the world, as the door into the world, because people did not like having pretty much the only Asian American mutant at the time kind of be that narrating force. I don't think people realize how much people really hated that, but I know there were talks about it. I can't remember where I learned that at, but I know that because it used to be you could get these episodes on VHS tape, and in the beginning they'd have like a writers roundtable. If you've never seen these, for anyone who's never seen these are great. These are VHS tapes of the individual episodes, and they come in these like black cases with like red holographic outlines of the characters. Super iconic. And when I talk about iconic and iconography, I always look at it as a kind of a visual aesthetic thing. So if you've never seen them, they're amazing. I had them. I had them when I was at once upon a time. I found them at a garage sale somewhere.
But they almost sound like collector's items, to be honest.
Well, that was a big thing in the 90s, especially with comics, and comics like stuff was like foil variants and like extra covers. And the X-Men had a really cool collectible card series that they did for a long time that I don't think I ever really invested in. But yeah, there was collectors thing were kind of this really great big thing. They didn't do as much with the animated series as they probably could have. Because there's a lot of really good iconography in this. And for people that are listening that hear the words iconic and iconography all the time, iconic and iconography is really about a visual message you're sending with the character or with a setting. And so for the iconography of the X-Men, you could talk about the costumes and the fashion, but my iconography for the X-Men is also about things like the scene behind me, which if you're watching on YouTube, if you're coming back to the episode to see the kind of our faces, the way they did everything in the blue tone instead of the gray, and the way that they incorporated computers without trying to go futuristic silly, and they kept it really dystopian, even right up until the introduction of Cable and Bishop, and it still had that really bulky 90s computer-esque feel, but they still had some holographs in it. For me, that's an iconography of this moment in time that only the X-Men could pull off, because it was kind of unapologetically Carmen Sandiego-ish, in a way that Carmen Sandiego wouldn't really commit to, ironically. Because when I think of this, I think of the fashions of it. I think the fashions are great. I still remember the pink and purple of the Sentinels. And I remember when I was little being really confused as to why Galactus didn't have his headpiece on, because it's almost the same color scheme as Galactus. I think there's a reason that they try really hard not to copy them when they do Sentinels in movies, but without kind of what they look like, it's really hard for the audience to connect with them, because these terrifying giant 4-story silo robots are kind of great. If I thought I wouldn't fall over and die at a con, I would consider putting on platform heels and dressing as a Sentinel. Like, I have no problem with that idea.
For me, that same ideas come to mind. If I ever had sheer amount of money to carry this off, to do a replica of the original Power Rangers Megazord and just stomp around at the convention.
It's really hard to do.
Yeah.
The trick is something that you can actually walk in, because I tried to do it once with boxes, but I didn't leave anything for my knee. And so there was no way to really, like, I'd have had to put on roller skates and had someone push me around cons so I could have walked in it.
Oh my God, if you had gone flat on your face, it would have been the most ultimately embarrassing moment. I would have died.
What's interesting too is that there is a connection to Power Rangers with the X-Men animated series. And this is something I learned last night that tickled me pink, and I think you'll enjoy this. Do you want to guess what it is before I tell you?
Is it a comic crossover?
It is not a comic crossover yet.
Because
they've been doing a lot of those in Boom Studios, bless them, and I would love to see it, but it is not yet.
I know that they did one where the original X-Men ended up in the Stargate Next Generation universe. Oh, and before that, the original Star Trek universe as well.
It's not that, but I love the idea.
Mm.
So the guy that did the theme for X-Men the animated series, the American, not the
Right.
not the Japanese version, is actually the same person that did the compositions for the first 6 seasons of the American Power Rangers. I think his name is Ron Watzerman or something like that.
Oh,
And so the guy is still working. If you look at his IMDb Wikipedia page, like he's still doing theme songs, but he did the VR Troopers theme song, all of 6 of the original Power Rangers, and this, like all in the same decade period. And so this X-Men theme is also the same person that wrote Go Go Power Rangers, which is kind of his calling card, is this like pop heavy metal thing that we have going on. So
oh, how interesting! I love finding out little facts about that. It just shows you that people can have such connections over a whole bunch of properties.
I
Really
will
great.
say I also do love the mixture of reality and fantasy in the X-Men the animated series. And what I mean by that is that you have the show itself, the show proper, which is, very grounded, very gritty, very like, at the time Spawn was a big thing because we had a weird moment with Spawn in the early 90s. They had their own movie and their own it had its own animated series too, Spawn did for a while. But when I think about the X-Men, I think about kind of the juxtaposition of that gritty, really grounded, almost bizarre dystopia with the fantasy opening where everyone is displaying their powers on a background where they're all just floating, and then the Earth is like just rotating around them and they're battling each other. And for some reason, Wolverine's claws like spark, which is not something that happens anytime in the series.
No, that's true.
And so when I think about it, I kind of really love the juxtaposition. This show both took itself very seriously in content, but also realized how much of a fantasy it was, and it didn't have that problem training the audience to understand it both as reality and fantasy. And I think some comics had a lot of trouble doing that when they some of them felt like they wanted to apologize for their own source material, and some of them were just cash grabs. So, but the X-Men didn't really feel like that to me.
No, indeed. It never felt cheap. Even when they
well, the last 2 seasons the Philippines did. They
well,
were a little, but bear in mind Disney
yeah,
had this problem too with the Little Mermaid and Hercules. They sent them to Korea.
yes.
And so that's why their animation quality dipped, because they started to outsource like their afternoon Saturday shows. So it wasn't just the X-Men doing it. It's just the X-Men where the marketed decline in quality starts to really, really slip there close to the end.
Yes. No, sorry. I think my brain had retroactively deleted the last season of X-Men out of my head.
No, you
But
can't though, because that's the only season with Bobby in it. That's the only season with Iceman with Bobby Drake. And I mean, not that I don't enjoy a good blowing of a soda bottle a la X-Men 1, which is really arguably the best moment in canon for the X-Men. But it's kind of one of those things where you have to take the bitter with the sweet, because just having the last original X-Men cast member from Team Blue, Bobby, actually show up, because he was the only one that didn't show up that was part of that kind of original team. And so unfortunately, you can't throw it out because of the animation style, because Bobby is super important, in spite of probably what Bobby would say, actually.
But going back to my point, the X-Men never felt cheap, even when they spent some episodes just focusing on a few characters over the whole cast, which I think was their way to try and balance out all of the larger story plots that they were focusing on, and all of the action scenes. They tried to give it more depth. And what I really noticed was they actually touched upon a lot of different genres during their time. They had romance and proper human drama, especially with the ongoing Scott, Logan, Jean love triangle, which is a whole whole pack of stuff to.
Which got resolved recently in the comic because now they're just together, all three of them, which I actually kind of love.
Yep.
I'm equal measures both loved and annoyed by it, just because the idea of "will they, won't they" is one of my favorite weird tropes in rom-coms. But that's neither here nor there. That's a me personal thing. Speaking of Wolverine, yes, no, go ahead, finish your point.
Sorry, I was just going to say that they did that, and other times they would lean more into fantasy elements. There's a whole thing about the mystical nature of Juggernaut, for example. But then they did a full-on space sci-fi opera when they went off to fight the Phoenix and the Cosmic Crystal, and they got very strangely metaphysical when they were all sucked into the blasted thing and were battling basically the embodiment of the universe inside the crystal.
Crystals were really big in the 90s too, because like Sonic had crystals, there was crystal on the street, like crystals had a big moment in the early 90s. So
you had Gem and the holograms. Sorry, a little word.
I mean, technically they weren't gems. We did have the troll babies that had little gems in their tummies. No. Those were big for a moment.
We to give a good example, we had Princess Genevieve and the Jeweled Warriors over here in the UK. It was about a young princess and her two friends who are also princesses, and they were fighting the evil Morgana Le Fay to find the magic crystals of the kingdom. And when they got the crystals, they got extra magic powers.
That sounds like going to gay pride for me. So that just sounds like an annual occurrence for me.
There was hot boys riding wolves, and they had their own forest crystal and everything. It was very sort of Winx before Winx was a thing.
Winx Club. Just after my time, but I appreciate it.
Anyway, sorry, sir. Going back to the topic, you were saying something about Logan.
I don't know if this falls under Logan or Wolverine, because I think this is one of the few times where Wolverine is not distinctively Logan or Wolverine. I know for a while in Marvel Universe, he hasn't really been Wolverine because X-23 is Wolverine now.
Yes.
So he's just been Old Man Logan for like 20, 30 years now or something like that. I don't know how long he's been. Comics are expensive, so I can't keep up. But if anybody wants to send me a whole bunch of Wolverine comics, I wouldn't turn them down. So what's really interesting is that you don't really get a delineation between Logan and Wolverine in this. Like sometimes the comics do, but for me, Wolverine is one of the more interesting characters in the series, because in a world where they're going to have the big bad fight, but there aren't as many consequences, kind of in that Buffy-esque style we see later in high fantasy, or like a Stargate thing where everything gets reset at the end of the episode. Wolverine has some major PTSD for almost all of season 1 over leaving Morph behind, and the idea that Morph has been killed, even though Morph comes back. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it, but if you haven't seen it, it came out in 1992, you're fine. But it's really interesting because the character that most people think of as this gruff, antisocial, non-caring, Strider character shows more of their Aragorn side. Like, they are torn up for a long time. They have a lot of survivor's guilt about Morph being taken away. And the idea of a show showing PTSD grief in that way is actually a rather big thing that you really don't see of in a lot of comics. And when I think of the X-Men, I think of those first 2 or 3 episodes where we meet Morph very quickly, and Morph goes out with Wolverine to, like, they're going to like a place to steal database information on a floppy disk, which I also chuckle about a little bit. They're not even using USB sticks at the time because we didn't have them. They didn't have the language for them in 92. Everything was still floppy disks and hard disks at that point. There wasn't an internet back then, kids. It was really scary. There was a little bit of internet, but it wasn't as good. In any case, so it's the idea of we go basically from the first episode and kind of the fun thing, which is, Sentinels are bad, but Storm's going to be there to rescue you from the mall, and the mall is all arcades and everyone is there. To the idea of Wolverine having full-on breakdowns in grief and anger, and wanting to get revenge and to rescue, Morph, or to like just do a lot of damage because he feels guilty over Morph. You get that. You get Beast as a political prisoner, essentially being sent to jail just because he's a mutant. I think that was just because he was a mutant. He wasn't framed for anything in that one.
I think he was being framed for something. I think he was being. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Anyways, well, he was sent to prison, basically for being a mutant, which is kind of a really big thing. And yeah, when I think about the X-Men, I do think about it's so cool that Cyclops can shoot laser beams out of his eyes, and now it's great that we've got like KGZ87 cosplaying this really kind of sexy Cyclops, and I'm not mad about it. But like when I think about X-Men the animated series, it's about Jubilee's parents not accepting her and learning how to fit in with this group of people that are like her in a lot of ways. Say what you want about Jubilee, but if you could shoot fireworks out of the tips of your fingers, everybody would take you seriously. Yeah.
But she was a very odd case. She was, at some points of the story, she was quite efficient and effective, and her powers did actually had some uses. But over times, they almost seemed to hit the reset button on her for specific stories, and she would be more ineffectual.
I do wonder how much that comes from the comics, because they kept trying to kind of make her a lead in the comics, and they get real pushback about that. And so I wonder how much of that is like pressure on the writers from what was then a growing fan base. Because yes, there are a lot of like women in the X-Men off and on, but for the most part, it was written by dudes, and a lot of kind of that rogue Jean Grey, Moni revealing skin tight catsuit like outfit they had to wear. I wonder how much of it was just an inability to write a female character consistently. How much of it was like, because Jubilee is supposed to be kind of the young, the hip, the now, the kind of the blossom of the X-Men that the kids could kind of gravitate to, the teens, and then everyone else is more the adults. But if you have a whole bunch of dudes, if you have a sausage fest trying to write this young hip female character, I just can't I can't believe that it's completely like I don't think it's harmful necessarily, but I can't say there was no like internalized misogyny of we can't let Jubilee be as strong as say Gambit. Which when we talk about queering the X-Men, let's talk about Gambit. Oh my god.
Well, if this actually leads nicely onto the point about queerness within the X-Men, I suppose. Because we could touch upon all things, but why don't you talk about Gambit first of all, as our little foray?
Oh my god. Okay, so I did not. It's one of those weird things, because every time they cast Gambit in an X-Men movie, my mind always goes back to this specific X-Men Gambit. It goes to this kind of red-haired, bon vivant, heterosexual / heteroflexible guy who's definitely flirting with everyone and cares nothing. Like, this is the X-Men character where I'm always like, why is this person here? Like, if you think Wolverine doesn't belong in an X-Men team, what is Gambit doing in the school? Like, what is happening? And I know it's kind of to just flirt and be with Rogue, which I think is a choice. But like from that kind of, because the palette of Gambit is very, very close in a way to the Sentinel palette. It's that kind of hot pink, but just red enough to be masculine kind of pink. And it's got that kind of brown trench coat thing going on. and he's got this like Kenny Rogers gambling persona, and it's very much like will they, won't they, in the same way that Maverick was, which was a weird popular movie with Mel Gibson in the 90s. There was like this weird thing about kind of romance between cowboys going on in America in the early 90s, but it was all very much like plausible deniability. Let's put Helen Hunt between them so that when James Garner and Mel Gibson flirt, that it's not like not flirting kind of thing. Um, and it's really interesting because when people think about the X-Men, they always think about Wolverine being the one that doesn't fit. But in the case of the X-Men 92, except for when they go off to do Genosha and it splits the team essentially in half for people that want to stay, people that want to go, it always felt like Gambit was the one that didn't fit. And even though he tended to just flirt with Rogue, it always kind of felt like at the drop of a hat, he would have flirted with Cyclops or Beast to get what he wanted. Because it didn't feel like it was about Rogue specifically. Like, yeah, they kissed and he called her Mon Cher. But like, I have no problem envisioning the X-Men 92. I'm hoping in X-Men 97, he's like, here's my boyfriend and my girlfriend and their boyfriend and girlfriend kind of thing. I'm really hoping for that. But it always felt to me like, in a way, he's the way that Iceman gets treated sometime, as this kind of strange bon vivant character. And I don't think Gambit in this series was made into one of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was something that did happen once in the comics, but I don't think it happened in this series.
No, it was Angel and then some, I think it was some random mutants that Apocalypse.
By the way, and Angel Archangel is my favorite character out of all the X-Men. So that's actually a really big, important thing to me personally as a fan of the show, and also why I hate X3 is because of how they treat Angel, among other things.
He was so bigged up in the promotional material as this new inclusion, but not only
we have
was
to talk about that separately because that
yeah.
I could go off on a tangent with that. So
yes, no, yeah, definitely, it was very shocking to see how he was in X3. I don't think he hardly had any speaking lines either.
oh no, he was like he approached Storm and talked to her in a German accent, and he had 3 lines, and then he was flying out of a window to get away from his parents, and then we never see him again. I don't think he's even in the final fight of the.
He is. He saves someone as they're like falling from the sky or something or other. But that's literally his inclusion. He almost like a cameo appearance at that
all
point.
The promo material. I have so many thoughts because it's so good. Because the idea of sorry, I'm going to manipulate this for a second here, but I really love the idea of Angel, and I don't know if they dig as deep as they do in the comics, but so they take Angel, this kind of peacenik character with these angelic wings, they take away his wings in the comics, and I think that happens in the 92 animated series as well, which is kind of why he ends up hooking up. But to turn him into Archangel, to change his skin color, to give him metallic wings, to go from that nature to that kind of science fiction-y thing, and then to have him deal with the repercussions. This is almost like Wolverine's PTSD all over again, in a way, to have him deal with the idea of, I've always thought of myself as peaceful, but I'm actually really angry inside. And like my wings can't hide that anger. It's very like Dean Winchester. And it was such a really wonderfully provocative thing. Also, I just thought Angel was super hot with like the blue skin and the red markings. It was very much like alien kind of symbiote Venom energy going on, and I wasn't mad about it. Like, I didn't know why I wasn't mad about it, but I was not mad about it.
Oh no, he was definitely very easy on the eye. Let's just put it that way, in any of his forms. And I think that that was one of his core appeals and such. He's definitely not blue in the current incarnation of the comics. He had a great outfit for the X-Men Hellfire Gala, but that's where the people have managed to read that far ahead into the comics and the massive world changes that have happened to the series. But again, that's going into a whole other ball game, shall we say. What I really enjoyed about Angel's struggle and everything like that is even though these are fantastical things and very fantasy sci-fi things are happening, the way that they portrayed different struggles within the cartoon, it was so relatable to people watching what was happening to these individuals that you couldn't help but feel connected to them. And I think I'm touching on like a major point here about why the community quite likes the X-Men is the fact that I'm trying to think of the best way to put it here. The X-Men were not afraid to really go in detail and depth about people, what their characters were going through, what these people with fantastical powers were dealing with very real personal problems. You had X-Men, sorry, not X-Men. You had the Beast, and he was worried about his looks and about if he could actually have a romantic relationship and feel connection with other people.
Colossus gets fired for doing his job. I think in the
that
episode,
really angers
Colossus gets fired because he can actually literally punch things and it doesn't hurt him, and they fire him because he's a human bulldozer before he even transforms.
Oh, don't get me started, Colossus. One of the nicest men in the entire bloody
and
comic.
Such a hunk.
Well,
so I want to give some context too, going back to your point, and I want people to understand this because I think we've been far away from the 90s. People have forgotten. So in the late 80s, early 90s, we had a satanic panic here in America. Like there were literally book burning and Chucky doll burning bonfires. And so in 92, when you're watching the X-Men and you see people protesting with angry signs and you see vigilante groups going after the X-Men, that was not too far from reality. We had queer people in America saying, if I die, lay my dead body on the steps of Congress, because no one was doing anything about the AIDS epidemic, which was affecting the other. And so, like, to see that in a cartoon wasn't disturbing, but it was just an affirmation of where we were as a society. It was such, like, I remember coming out of a JCPenney once, and like, there was a person from PETA that had chained themselves to the asphalt because JCPenney was selling fur. Protests in the 90s were extreme in early 90s America in a lot of ways, different than what they are now. Because I don't think there was quite as much brutality in them from the police angle. That is a completely new thing, which is a whole nother thing. But just for people that need some context, that either don't remember the 90s in that way or weren't there for it, or were perhaps in another part of the country where it wasn't that, it was not shocking to me because I had enough knowledge of what was going on, even like in my little like 7-year-old brain. To a vigilante group wasn't like, if you were part of something that was more austere religiously in America at that time, book burnings were a thing that happened. Like it was a very literal thing. And so to see these kind of mutant anti-mutant rights groups like
I've got their name here, the Friends of Humanity.
Oh my god. And I'm just like, when I think about that, I also think about the group from True Blood. I think that we're also very close to the title Friends of Humanity. It's not a far stretch. It wasn't a far stretch for me even back then, like as a kid, without any idea of the person I'd become later in life, of what I'd start to feel. Like it just was not. When they say kids can handle like harder stuff, I'm like, were you alive in the 90s? Because X-Men wasn't that far from the reality some of us were facing in life.
Indeed. So I rewatched X-Men a couple of years ago, as an adult, and I remember seeing all of this when I was a child, and really, even then, I was seeing clearly what these different groups and individuals were for what they really were. But it was as an adult rewatching it now and seeing dare I say, the Nazi references within the Friends of Humanity group. They have an iron eagle as their symbol, for God's sakes.
To be fair, nobody. I don't think anybody saw that coming. Like Reagan was bad, but I don't think anybody thought we were gonna, like that was somebody in the writers' room was like, we're gonna do this because this is never coming back. Like this imagery is too far, even for a
Mm,
dystopian future. But and yet here we are. Uh,
yes. On the on the other end of the spectrum, so I touched upon Beast and his struggles with, dare I say, his appearance, and if he could feel a connection to someone else because of that, or if someone would like him despite the fact that he doesn't fit in with, the common terms of attractiveness.
which
Uh,
I'm gonna be completely honest. I thought Beast was hot. Like I wasn't
oh,
mad about it,
yeah,
and they never put him in a shirt. Like even when he was like going to Congress to talk about mutant rights, here comes this
yeah.
big jacked blue furry dude shirtless. It's like having a werewolf for a friend. Like I'm not mad about it at all.
Intelligent, sophisticated, physically attractive. I
Reads
mean,
upside down. I mean, come on. What else do you need?
clearly a gentleman as well. I mean, it
Really?
ticks so many boxes. Um, but yes, he went through that struggle. Rogue went through a similar one, but from a different angle. Because her power to absorb other people's, well, dare I say, life energy. Because if you see what happened with her tussle with Captain Marvel, and she pretty much
Yeah.
absorbed a lot of Captain Marvel's personality, powers, and to the point that she left her in a coma.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about PTSD, Rogue's sense of guilt of what her powers did to Captain Marvel is such a touching, defining moment in the character.
And I
Um,
think this
but,
is one of the few times where they actually keep that origin story and they keep
mm,
that's part of how they bring in Mystique because Mystique had been in the background up to that point and this
mm,
was really bringing her to the forefront too as
yes,
Rogue's mother, quote, I think actual mother, but maybe mother, quote unquote. I'm not actually sure.
I think she was defined as a mother figure,
Yeah,
almost like an adoptive
like a
mother.
wine aunt. She's Rogue's wine aunt. Oh my god, that's an amazing thing. No, it's really I actually really love that the idea of I think that's a really good point to bring up about Rogue, and I think that is something Rogue's character gets glossed over for quite a bit. Um, yeah, no, I'm
Yeah,
just gonna say bravo on that point.
yeah. I think just to clarify what I was trying to get to at that point is the fact is that Rogue is then scared of physical intimacy and getting close to anyone because she's afraid that her power is going to hurt someone else. And it, it's really sad and touching to see her going through this. Um, and in a sense, I know what you were saying about like Gambit was flirting, flirting with Rogue, and you could easily imagine him flirting with other people as well, just because he's that sort of person. Um, but at the same time, he does sometimes have this subtle tenderness with her. And I think
Yeah.
from his personal experiences, so Gambit was raised as part of a clan in the swamp, and I think he was constantly going through a lot of trust issues in himself, like who he could trust and such.
He's
So,
also super domestic in the Xmen the animated series too. I think this is one of the few times we see him in the kitchen.
mm,
Like I believe there's a whole like subplot of him trying to make gumbo one episode um, for the family, which is kind of this interesting maternal thing you don't think of, especially on TV in the '90s. You don't really think of a man in the kitchen in that way, which is a really interesting way too.
mm. You actually lead me into another of my points, dear sir. The fact,
You're welcome.
oh,
Ah. Uh,
the X-Men as a found family.
Oh, and
Uh,
that's the queer thing right there. That's the ultimate queer thing
oh,
right there.
oh yes. So you mention that to people, and they go, "Oh yes, oh, this is my brother." Well, he's not really my brother, but he's the brother of my soul, and this is my sister, and our related friends, etc. You ask any queer person, and they have a whole bunch of people they want to introduce you to.
Yeah.
all of a sudden. But yes, the X-Men did feel like they were there for them. I mean, they risked their lives for each other on a week-to-week basis, if you think about it, and sometimes their souls.
So here's what's interesting, and here's where I talk about the interestingness of the queer experience is you go from that, and then the iconography of the characters is around so long that then you go from them just being found family to then by the time we start to get the internet really picking up steam, people start to see it more in a romantic relationship way where they're all in a relationship with each other. And I guess that's a thing where it's pretty common in queer circles in America for your found family to also just happen to be all of your exes that you dated at one point or the other, and is seen naked. But it's kind of an interesting thing that I struggle with, especially where X-Men 92 is involved, because I don't mind the idea of Wolverine and Cyclops as a couple outside of the context of this. But for me as a kid, seeing them as a found family, I find it kind of weird when people ship things specifically from this show with that specific thing in mind, because in some contexts, I want them to just be family and a group of superheroes fighting together. It doesn't have the same kind of charge that for me, Captain America has with Chris Evans in the role, because I didn't have that feeling for Chris Evans before he was in the MC. Well, I did, but not as a superhero. And it's really interesting to me to see that iconography be taken and then taken into a whole nother realm where I don't necessarily know if I feel comfortable having it as. Which is a really interesting thing, because I've just basically said I thought like 4 of the X-Men were like super hunks. But I can aesthetically enjoy a man without wanting to go to bed with them sometimes, most of the time, half the time. Some men are beautiful, but you just don't want them in bed, kind of thing.
Oh, exactly. You can appreciate the aesthetic of someone or someone for their mind or their brains or for a certain trait, but you don't necessarily, well, need to bed them,
yes,
shall we say. One can still appreciate. And that's a very important thing for a mature mindset to be able to have and acknowledge.
On the other hand, Rogue's inability to touch also leads me to my second favorite exchange, which Iceman is a participant in one of the X-Men movies, where Wolverine makes a reference to Rogue and Iceman trying to get it on, and it's like the weirdest, most fumbly thing you've ever heard between a father figure and his like daughter figure and her boyfriend. it's so cringy. It's amazing. There were some great moments in those movies. I would like to talk about those movies at some point as their own thing, because I think they should be discussed as their own thing. But you can't, it's kind of like when I talk about pop culture, I can't divorce the things that came before, because I know they influence the things that will come after. Like, I know the reason that the 2005 Fantastic Four movie is goofier and sillier is because the Fantastic Four TV we had before was all Hanna-Barbera. So the audience kind of has an expectation. Do you think the audience for this particular X-Men series had an expectation? Because in 92, we'd only had Batman probably for about a year at that point, if at all. I can't remember when exactly it came out. But really, you had Aeon Flux, you had Spawn, and you had Spider-Man were the only real superhero properties. There was also the Tick, but the Tick was doing like a really goofy take, a satire on superheroes. So do you think people expected the X-Men product they got in 92? Like, do you think that, because I know some parents weren't thrilled about it, but like, do you think the kids knew what they were getting into?
Just to quickly touch on the point about the parents not being thrilled about it, I think maybe it was not just the storylines, but also the fact that the X-Men were clearly like subtly sexualized. Because I remember
would you call Rogue wearing cargo pants that were skin colored subtle sexualization? I would definitely not say Jean Grey's subtly sexual. The thing where she moaned every time she touched her forehead
Oh,
was a little. It was a little
oh.
bit much. Um,
Mm,
yeah.
yes. So to answer your question, I don't think the kids of that era would have known what to expect. I will make a point that I think the demographic has changed quite a bit though since then. So what I mean by that is, if you think about it, you were just saying about the fact that there wasn't many peer series back then for
Yeah.
what superheroes were. So a lot of kids might have read the comics and such, and so they knew might have known some of the characters somewhat as they were going into the cartoon. Um, it would have been more perhaps the teenagers, adults that were fans that would have known more what to expect, but even they probably wouldn't have known fully what it was going to be like. I would say that these days, that because a lot of kids will have grown up with superhero cartoons, movies, really, unfortunately, to the point I do think there is quite a bit of oversaturation of superhero properties nowadays. It's very difficult for someone to live a life without having superheroes
So
surrounding
here's
quite a bit.
so here's an interesting. Oh yeah.
So my main point was, I don't think they knew what to expect, but the demographic back in that time period really had, I think, very little. Um, no, not it's not knowledge. That's not the word I'm looking for. Um, Perhaps experience would be the worst word. It's not what I was looking for either. They would have had very little experience of superhero properties in comparison to what we've got in this day and age.
Yeah. So here's a couple of interesting things to think about, and I kind of want to use the idea of context as a way to kind of wrap up how we're talking about this, because we're getting on to about an hour, and I want to be able to respect your time. But in the comics
Yeah.
books, in 1986 is when the Dark Ages begins, and the Dark Ages are Frank Miller's Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, where he finally gets like a Gatling gun, I think, or something like that, and Alan Moore's Watchmen book. Um, and so that's in 1986, and then that starts to kind of train kids that read comics fantasy when we start getting things like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat in the arcades. Um, and so here's kind of an interesting thing to think about is that comics are going through this transformation in 86, the year that I was born, incidentally. Um, and 86 is also where the DCU was rewritten following Crisis on Infinite Earths, which then later we get that great scene when they do it again, where Robin and Jubilee are kissing in a canal boat in Venice, which I always think about for giving Jubilee an appropriate love interest. Um, so I do wonder. I think for me, because I always look in context of the time, if Xmen is a response to this kind of 1986 start of the Dark Ages, these new gradier comics. I'm looking at a picture of the cover of the New Mutants with like I think this is Cable here. It's Cable, and you've got these like sharpshooter sights on these New Mutants that are Marvel characters, but uh, they're not mutants that you're actually like super invested in. This is not the main cast. One of them kind of looks like Dakin, but I don't think it's Dakin. And so there's something kind of interesting about the idea of you didn't have any subtlety. You were either in the camp of where you were watching things like Eek the Cat and The Tick, which were kind of poking fun at a superhero thing and making it light and bright-hearted, or you had the Adult Swim kids that were watching The Critic and Space Ghost Coast to Coast, or you had the Disney kids that were watching Darkwing Duck, which is a spoof of Batman, essentially. And there really doesn't seem to be a lot of nuance. There just seems to be this: you were either getting real dark, you were getting real parody and ironic, or you were getting like real high fantasy in a way. And I think that's kind of an interesting where it was definitely it feels like there were just these extremes, but you kind of had to pick and choose because there was no real brand loyalty either, because all of us kids in different portions of the country got these cartoons at different times of day.
Mm.
In fact, the Fox Kids network that did X-Men and Batman before it moved to the UPN, before it started doing like Yu-Gi-Oh! And the Jackie Chan adventures, they wouldn't actually put time slots down. So you never knew when you were going to see these shows. Like you never knew if you were going to see
Interesting.
Bobby's World, Eek the Cat, then the X-Men. Like you kind of figured X-Men was going to be last because then the X-Men would lead into like the after Saturday afternoon movie that was usually the Goonies. But I was reading this and I hadn't remembered this. They gave you the block of shows, and they had they had like not cartoons, but they had commercials between them. But for a large portion of it, because they were buying them almost show by show and stations are being taken over by Fox and Disney in different measures, you never really knew what was going to come on when, especially on Saturdays. And if you had like a weird station like I did that played the Cara Burnett show at 3 a.m, and then you switched over to Nickelodeon for the for like Legends of the Hidden Temple, and then you switched to the cartoons, you sometimes it was hard to keep track of what was going on where and when you'd be able to see something.
Yes. But I have one last point to make for the X-Men before we wrap up our little session today. It sort of touches upon what you were saying about a reaction to the Dark Ages and such. Something I always loved about X-Men was the cartoon always felt like it had strong messages of hope and perseverance through difficulties. The X-Men have always traditionally gone through a lot of crap. They've always had so much against them. They've had to deal with all of these people acting against them for various reasons and such. But at the same time, despite the fact that it shows how sometimes they do struggle, they always managed to pull themselves through, and they were always there for each other. And it's very clear, like how their willpower was so strong to get through and to overcome these difficulties. And I think that's it. All that comes right back round to how I was saying that I felt these characters were quite iconic, because they become such role models in your head, because of the fact that they never give up and they always find a way to resolve the situations that they're in. And I think that's why it did appeal to quite a few people.
I mean,
So,
I also
sorry.
just love the cool villains, but that was me.
Oh yeah.
That was one thing I'd love to talk. If we ever do talk about the X-Men again, just in context of the X-Men itself, I would love to talk about like Arcade and Forge and things that were like kind of the smallish things that didn't make it into many of the things, because you never saw Forge outside of a video game. Really, you saw you either knew him because you ended up with a comic with Forge in it, but Forge is one of those kind of like X-Men characters that was really useful and like didn't make it into like big properties outside of the video games for a long time. So
Oh yes, we can definitely. Well, we could have a podcast to talk about the villains and maybe then talk about some other cool bits and pieces about X lore.
that was the
And
thing that bummed me about Days of Future Past and the whole Young X-Men trilogy was they ended at the last one, and I was so excited to see reference to Mr. Sinister, and then because like nobody saw that movie or everybody hated it, I didn't get my Mr. Sinister movie, and it made me so unhappy.
Well, Mr. Sinister will have his time in the sun through our podcast.
Hopefully. Anyway, well,
crossed.
thank you for joining me for ramblings about my feelings about the Fox Kids Network, and the X-Men, the 92 X-Men series. we didn't even get to touch on kind of the time travel and the idea of dystopia versus utopia. So there's obviously more about this to talk about. I always invite people to kind of talk. We're gonna have a YouTube page open for old episodes, so there's comment sections available. But if you're listening to us on Anchor, if there's a way to leave a comment, you can feel free to drop a message to us. We should be available on Spotify. I have no idea how that works because I'm old. But if there's a way to comment there, feel free. We can also be reached on, we should be in Google Podcasts now. And in theory, we're in iTunes, Apple Podcasts, but who knows? But yeah, we'll be back again in a couple of weeks for a preview. I went ahead and made the command decision that I wanted to talk about my favorite straight couple in all pop culture history, Sabrina and Harvey. So we'll be talking about the 90s Sabrina, and I will be doing my Melissa Joan Hart diatribe. So stay tuned for that. And I'm doing finger guns for people that can't see me.
Indeed. And discussing the sheer fabulousness of Salem.
Oh yeah, Salem, the modern day Bacchus, who all the internet kids have rediscovered, and it always tickles me pink that has happened. Thank you everyone for joining us in 90s vernacular. I hope that your day is both radical and tubular.